Hey everyone. Okay, this is a video lecture that's going along with the other video from this week. And in the overview video for this week, which I hope you've already watched, I talked a little bit about the big shifts in immigration in the sort of second half of the 20th century. That immigration once again started to increase in this country, and that it increased from particular regions, different regions than were the sort of predominant regions where immigrants came from, really throughout the course of American history before this. So what I want to do in this video is provide you with a little bit of historical context to understand why, right? Why that shift, what explains that shift, and how do we kind of see it more clearly. So here's how this is going to go. I'm going to start with a little bit of review, particularly of some of the laws that you learned about last week and read about last week, because they are a really important part of the context to understand what's going on and why it's going on the way it's going on, okay? And then I want to talk to you a little bit about the Cold War, but particularly about the Cold War and its impact on creating refugees. And the sort of main kind of argument of this lecture, of this video, is essentially that, the two chapters that you're going to read from Roger Daniels' book about new Asian migrants and essentially sort of new American migrants from Central America and the Caribbean and places like that, right? That the reason that these groups begin to migrate to the United States has everything to do with the Cold War. Right? The Cold War explains why the migration happens from the places that it happens in this period, right? In the period of like 1950 to 1990, okay? So that's what I'm going to try to get across to you in this. So let's start with that review and review first and foremost the kind of concept of a refugee. So a few weeks ago, I talked in a video about how World War II is really the event that kind of creates the concept of a refugee, right? And it really comes out of, honestly, not only the massive amount of displacement of peoples in Europe and Asia and lots of other places because of the fighting, right? Lots of people fled their homes, their communities to get away from bombings and shellings and things like that, right? But also, and more specifically, actually, it was the experience of the Holocaust that started a conversation about understanding how and why migrants, happen, right? Why migration happens, and identifying a particular type of migration, a migration away from essentially oppression, from systematic persecution and genocide, right? So this is why, actually, the UN starts talking about refugees very early on in the years just following World War II. And actually, in 1951, the United Nations forms a whole sort of division, right? A whole part of the organization called the UNHCR. And the UNHCR is essentially the UN's wing for dealing with refugees, right? And the UNHCR in the early 1950s put out statements about what their definition of a refugee was, and I could sort of show those to you, but I think it's actually better to look at how this concept shows up in US law in the years that come, right? So you already start to see this in the Walter McCarran Act that you read about last week in the 1950s, but the one that really kind of stipulates this more clearly is the 1965 Immigration Act. And part of the 1965 Immigration Act, if you remember reading that, said that in addition to all the sort of quotas and the new system that the 65 Act set up, there would also be conditional entry for, quote, aliens that because of persecution on account of race, religion, or political opinion have fled from any communist or communist-dominated era. And essentially what the 65 Act says is that if a person is fearing persecution based on race, religion, political opinion, and particularly facing persecution while living in communist countries or areas where communism is sort of present, that they can qualify for entry into the United States as a refugee, right? And then finally, this system is sort of formalized in the 1980 Refugee Act, which not only clarifies that definition more, right, or sort of entrenches that definition of a refugee, it also expands it to include asylum seekers who are apparently who are specifically people who leave the country before they have been sort of granted access into another country, and thus apply for refugee status from some different country, whether it be the United States or somewhere else, right? But the 1980 Act also, what it does is it sets up refugee immigration as a thing that's entirely separate from the normal mechanisms of immigration in this country, right? So refugees don't have to apply for visas and things like that. They are worked through a totally different mechanism, the refugee mechanism, right? So by 1980, right, we have this concept of a refugee already ingrained in U.S. immigration law, and a system set up to process and quickly sort of bring in migrants who qualify as refugees. Now, the big question, and the thing that sort of explains the rest of this lecture is this. So, what kinds of people qualify as a refugee? In other words, how do people qualify as a refugee and thus get sort of ushered into the United States through these new mechanisms that the law sets up? When the concept of a refugee was first sort of invented in the wake of World War II, right, you can sort of see that the thing that they were thinking about as refugees were like European Jews suffering from the Holocaust, people who, because of their race and religion, right, were being systematically persecuted and eliminated, right, and killed. This was kind of the original vision of what a refugee was. But the Cold War helps explain how that definition gets sort of expanded and then meted out, right, in actual real life, in real life circumstances. And that's why the 1965 Act specifically says, right, that if you're fearing persecution because of race, religion, or political opinion, and you're from a communist-dominated country, right, those are the people that were seen as being clearly refugees according to U.S. law, right? The 1980 Act kind of backs off specifically saying communist countries, but in talking about sort of being persecuted because of political opinion, it's essentially referring to people who are in either totalitarian states or communist states and are not communists, right? Who want to flee. So the Cold War essentially is the main answer for the question of how does someone qualify as a refugee, right? How does someone identify as a refugee and thus gain access to the United States? And it does it essentially in two ways, right? The Cold War essentially essentially kind of produces a lot of the immigration that we see in the decades from 1950 to 1990, really for two main reasons. One, the Cold War produced wars all over the world, and as we've studied in the past, wars produce migration. People leave war zones, and then they have to go somewhere else, right? So the Cold War, first and foremost, produces lots of people fleeing, right? The destruction and death that comes along with the war. And then second, because the Cold War was what the Cold War was, right? Because it was this kind of political contest, because it was so ingrained in U.S. law in terms of the sort of fears of communism and things like that, it provided the kind of explanation or the reason for people to apply for admission to the United States and get admitted as a refugee, right? So if you were fleeing because of a war, and if that war was a part of the larger Cold War struggle, you could effectively apply for admission to the United States and be granted it. At least that's what we sort of see. So to kind of clarify this more, I just want to run through a few hotspots, Cold War hotspots, that sort of illustrate this point, right? The first one that we sort of see this in is Korea. The Korean War was fought from 1950 to 1953, and it was essentially one of the first kind of Cold War conflicts. It pitted the U.S.-backed South Korean army against the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China-backed North Korean army, right? It was incredibly deadly and devastating war, especially for the Korean Peninsula. Over 3 million people died in the conflict. And lots and lots and lots of people, tens of thousands of people, were displaced because of it, right? Whether internally in Korea or externally. In the war's aftermath, what you find is that a lot of the people that were sort of displaced decided to make a case to try to migrate to the United States. We see that migration right from the very early point of the 1950s, but it kind of increases gradually over the course of the following decades. And you can look back at the other video to see the exact numbers of Korean migration. But this is the first kind of instance where we see people starting to apply for admission to the United States based on sort of a refugee status that's tied to a Cold War hotspot. Okay? A second one is in Cuba. The Cuban Revolution happens beginning really in 1956 and going all the way to 1959. And the revolution was essentially a political revolution in which a communist leader, Fidel Castro, ended up overthrowing the US-backed government of a guy named Fulgencio Batista. In 1959, right, Castro managed to take Havana, and Batista fled, right, and had essentially, effectively, control of the island of Cuba. The U.S. fought against Castro the entire way. He supported the government in their fight against Castro and his rebels, right? And even after Castro took over, the U.S. actually backed military action to try to overthrow him in 1961 in the Bay of Pigs sort of event, right? And so all of this kind of failed, right? I mean, Cuba ended up becoming communist and remained communist for decades upon decades upon decades, all the way to today. But what we see is that because of this revolution, right, it created a wave of migration out of Cuba, really beginning in the 1960s, and going all the way through the 1970s and 1980s as well, where people left Cuba, first because of the kind of disruption of the actual revolution itself, and then because of the actions of Castro and his government, right? The nationalization of property and various political repressions, acts of political repression that forced people off the island. In fact, the United States was so invested in Cuban migration that from 1965 to 1973, they actually sponsored what were called freedom flights. It was essentially one flight a day from Havana into, I think, Miami. And it just brought people who wanted to leave the country and come and migrate to the United States as refugees. Over 300,000 people migrated from Cuba to the United States through these freedom flights over the period from 1965 to 73. Another place that we see the same sort of dynamic happening is Vietnam. Of course, the Vietnam War is one of the main sort of hot spots, hot zones of the Cold War. From 1964 to 1973, the U.S. fought in Vietnam. And the war went really poorly. Not only were there tons of deaths, right, 58,000 U.S. deaths and over 3 million Vietnamese deaths, but also, right, the U.S. eventually ended up pulling troops out. And the South Vietnamese government was overcome, was eventually sort of overrun by the North Vietnamese government. The fall of Saigon was sort of the last stronghold of the South Vietnamese government, happened in 1975. And so what you see, right, is right in this period of the 1970s and into the 1980s, Vietnamese refugees, right, the Vietnamese refugee movement into the United States spikes, right? Look at the last video to see those numbers specifically, but it absolutely spikes. And we see tons and tons and tons and tons of Vietnamese refugees coming from Vietnam, making the case that they're fleeing a Cold War hotspot because of political repression, right? And getting placed in the United States, right? As legal immigrants. Now, Cold War hotspots were not just places that we think of these major conflicts, right? The Cold War was showing up all over the world in different ways. We can see this in Haiti, for example, right? There was no sort of communist revolution or anything in Haiti, but rather a series of sort of dictatorships that were set up and propped up by the United States, largely to try to resist any sort of Cuban-style, communist revolution happening in Haiti. So you get the same sorts of kind of Cold War dynamics happening in that country, but instead of a communist takeover in the country, you have this sort of US-backed dictatorship, which produced a lot of the same effects of sort of political oppression and economic disruption that a lot of these other Cold War hotspots went through, but without a communist government being attacked. And I think that's a really important sort of piece of knowledge to understand the context of what was going on in this period, right? And same thing in Central America as well. You see lots of different actions where the U.S. was propping up sort of non-communist dictatorships in order to prevent communist revolutions from happening. So what's the what's the whole takeaway? The whole takeaway here basically is that if you want to look at how migration changes, you can see that it's from Cold War hotspots that immigrants start coming into the country in this period.